us. So it's very gratifying to see so many come today. I'm going to introduce us, and then I'm going to become one of the faculty discussants. So about 10 years ago, Corey and Daryl and I thought that it might be fun to join the so-called Mormon moment, right, of 2012 when Mitt Romney was running and lots of other exciting things were happening, the Book of Mormon musical and other kinds of initiatives, that we do a session on Mormons in 19th century France at one of our professional organizations. And so in the fall of 2013, we held our first panel and our first session, and have been working on this off and on for several years, and are pleased to announce the publication of our book. Today is the official publication date, by the way, October 25th, of Marianne Meets the Mormons, Representations of Mormonism in 19th Century France. There we go. And yes, because there's so much shameless promotion going on here, right? I mean, I just happen to know the coordinator of European Studies who happens to schedule these events. We do have flyers in the back advertising the book. You can get 30% off either the paper or the hardback if you are interested. And we will be doing a number of other kind of events associated with this as well. So just before we get the conversation, I wanted to talk about the title and about the use of the word Mormon. And to be clear that because we're dealing with something that is historical, where folks in the 19th century would only identify us as being Mormon, not as being members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. You simply very, very rarely saw that in print. We have elected to use the term Mormons, and in fact, there are many different iterations of Mormons, Mormonites. What are some of the others? Mormony. Yes, so we do make that very clear in our introduction that we understand the contemporary Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is and should be called by that, but that it would be historically inaccurate and irresponsible for us to not use that appellation. So with that, I'm going to now move over to my next spot. Oh, I should probably introduce us, though, right? Okay, so I'm very pleased to have three professors, all of whom are part of the French Studies program. My co-authors, Corey Cropper, you want to wave? And Daryl Lee, both of them are professors of French Studies. Corey is the Associate Dean for the College of Humanities, and Daryl is the chair of the Department of French and Italian. And then our interlocutor, our discussant, is Carter Charles, who is a visiting professor in the Department of French and Italian this semester, and has also been associated with the church history program here. And I think that should be sufficient.
And this is Heather Belknap.
Hi, and my other hat is, yes, Heather Belknap. I'm an associate professor of art history and curatorial studies, and my specialty is 19th century French art.
Well, thank you. It's good to see you guys and to come discuss your book. I'll try not to be too technical, but there is a lot of things that I do want to understand. You mentioned, Heather, in your opening remarks, a Mormon moment, and you guys actually argue for that there is a Mormon moment in 19th century France. Can you tell me a little bit about that Mormon moment? The characteristics of that Mormon moment in the 19th century and why you see it as being typically French.
I can go ahead, but Daryl, jump in. This was an interesting project because three of us wrote it, and if you took any sentence out of here, we couldn't tell you who wrote which one. We collaborated on it.
There's that one mistake that I made.
Yeah. I wrote a book earlier on in my career where I was the sole author. I spent more time on this than I did on that one for sure. And it is a better book, too. So if one of us answers or the other answers, and cut me off,
I'm
please,
sure I can learn from all three of you. So.
But it's interesting, if you look at the use of the word Mormon in French newspapers in the 19th century, it actually tends to peak right around the time Brigham Young died. But and our whole book is really about the way that term was used and the way the idea of Mormonism was used throughout the 19th century. And then you see another peak around the time of the Smoot hearings, and you might have heard of Reed Smoot. Carter wrote his dissertation on Reed Smoot. And then it kind of drops off. And in fact, I think that there was more talk of Mormonism in 19th century France than there is today. When the temple happened, and that was around the same time, right? Around the Mitt Romney era, right? I don't know if we can call it that, but
Romney's presidential campaign.
Romney's presidential campaign, right? The temple was under construction. Had been announced. It was right around there, right, Carter? When was it dedicated?
2017.
2017. So we're right in that same time. So there's another peak of interest, but I think it was pretty short-lived. But in 19th century France, there's an obsession with our church because it resonated on a lot of different levels with what the French were dealing with themselves.
Right, and I think it's important to know that, am I the only one getting feedback, or?
You're good.
Good, good, okay. That the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and its actual presence in France at this time was quite small. And in fact, the French mission was closed in the early 1860s and wouldn't be reopened until 1911. Is that correct? And so that this was very, very much, these concepts of Mormons and Mormonism was not based on actual interactions with members of this church. Right? So this is what they're reading, this is what they're hearing, and we argue that this distance kind of enables the French to project some of their anxieties, their fears, their desires onto this new American religion with this colony out in the exotic American West.
I call them cultural moments. Am I picking up okay? You see these spikes at really crisis or critical moments as the French are trying to redefine themselves as a republic in particular, or they're debating certain things like their divorce laws in the early Third Republic. These are moments where we see smaller spikes of reference to Mormonism and drew us to certain kinds of texts and arguments that were being made where the French were availing themselves of this faraway religious movement. And you have to remember, it's not just a religious movement. When you think about the all-encompassing aspects of Mormon life, it's religious, of course. It's a belief system. It's a ritual system, but it's also an economic system. It's a family system. It's a marriage system. It's a system of urban planning. Joseph Smith, right, laying out the plot of Zion that becomes the basis for the way that cities are built across the frontier west all the way over to Salt Lake City. Mormonism encapsulated all of these aspects of society and made it available for all of these uses to which the French put the movement.
Okay.
But Carter, we had no idea when we first started on this project, we had no idea that we were so fascinating to the French. And that just, the numbers grew and grew, and in part, it's thanks to the digitizing that was happening at the Bibliothèque Nationale in particular, that was making it possible to, search, type in the term Mormon. And I think when we first began, there were maybe 2,000 hits?
Yeah.
Maybe. And now I haven't been recently, 7,000 maybe?
Thousands and
like
thousands of references.
Right. And that's just if you're searching Mormons. And then there are all of these other, terms, polygamy, Zion, Brigham Young, and the like. I mean, there's just an enormous amount of material that threatened to become overwhelming until we agreed that this is not a comprehensive look. We hope that that you, future scholars, start to dive into some of this material and find just how rich this is. And I'm really wishing that we thought to bring here to the cafe our graphic that shows the number of publications, because you can, there's a particular search engine that's the periodical press, where you can see kind of the number of mentions for the term Mormon, and it goes up around 18...
Yeah, around Brigham Young's death.
Brigham
so
Young's death, 1877, and then you're going to see another spike, 1890 with the Manifesto, and then another spike during the Reed-Smoot trials, and then it sort of drops off, and we're hardly in the press at all for most of the 20th century, and so we definitely we keyed into this before we had that data to know.
So one of the things that I find, you mentioned that the French are using Mormonism because that's the way they own the group, right? As screen to project onto their own fears and social issues and things like that. Among other things, you actually begin in the book with, ils ont lâché le fou. They've unleashed the jester. Can you tell us about this fou figure and why you find that important to the French people to project onto the Mormons, Latter-day Saints? Who wants to tackle that one?
Well, I think, Daryl, you're the one that found this quote. It's from the social theorist Hippolyte Taine, 1870s.
1860s, early 60s, yeah.
And he has this description of Mormonism being this experiment that is going against Enlightenment science.
Hundreds of years of rationality.
Yeah, we've been rational all this time, and now in the American West, we've released the fool. He writes, ils ont lâché le fou. They've let the fool out of the box. Now, what's interesting, though, and one of the things that helped us frame the whole book, is the fact that the word for fool in French, fou, also means jester. And so you can think of the jester as the person in the court who, makes jokes, keeps things light, but also reflects a certain truth back to the king about the court's own culture. And so that really is what interests us in this whole book, is how is Mormonism used to reflect back onto France their own issues. And so if you look at our book, we divide it into chapters like socialism, social structures, and that was big around the time of the 1848, in the wake of the 1848 social revolution that led to the Republic, the Second Republic. And Heather or Daryl, you already mentioned this, but the issues of divorce, and divorce becomes legal in France in 1884. And the thing that surprised me, we were digging through archives and we found that in the French Senate, they said if divorce becomes legal in France, we might as well all become Mormons. What they meant by that is that there would be like a series, you could divorce one person, marry another, so you would have multiple spouses, right? But the fact that Mormonism was raised in that context multiple times suggests that they were using Mormonism to work through their own issues.
If I could intervene, I mean, one of the things that's interesting is I don't think we realize to what extent there is a rich and vibrant media culture in France, starting in the 1830s and 40s with penny presses. Everybody's reading the newspaper. There's a high rate of literacy. And there's also, on the scientific side and the cultural side of France, this interest in new kinds of social sciences like anthropology, geography, and history that are being developed. So France is this country that's very proud of its own history and culture, but also turned towards this outside world. And they're getting these reports, weekly and monthly reports about what's going on in the United States, and they're tracking these things more closely than what's happening right now in Utah or with the church around the world has been really tracked in France since probably the early 20th century. They really are carefully monitoring these things. They're translating reports in the English press as well, the American press. So there's a great deal of information circulating as a result of this communication infrastructure that's in place in France at the time and allows them some knowledge of these things that seem pretty esoteric to us, but in fact were almost household bits of knowledge.
So one of the ways they own, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that, Heather, but perhaps you can add immediately after this. One of the ways they own Mormonism is also through art. We have depictions, right? For instance, I think there is this instance where this is a typical, can you tell us something about this figure here? This is typical French author, right?
Yes. Yes, and this was one of those finds. When I came across this, I knew that I'd found, a golden nugget, because this is none other than Victor Hugo, the great 19th century novelist and social thinker, et cetera, who is being approached.
So Mormonism meets Victor Hugo meets Mormonism somehow?
Yes, we could have called it that. We could have called it Victor meets the Mormons, but we wouldn't have had the alliteration that's there. We should probably talk about that title in just a moment. But what we have is that he is being offered these young women on a platter by 3 Mormon men, possibly missionaries. And so, and this is something that's completely escaped attention. That's one of the phenomenal things. Is there's been quite a bit of work that's been done on images that come out of the United States, that come out of England, but nothing really here on the French. And so, as an art historian, to be able to find new things in the field of 19th century France, it was very exciting. So. Yeah, this is the image, the lead image, because we allow kind of the story around it to frame the conversation.
Well, I was going to say, do you want to explain why do you remember? So that I could translate the caption.
Yeah, that would help.
So what's going on here?
Mormons, desirous to have descendants from the great Victor Hugo, offer wives to him and ask that he will accept these young wives.
Right.
So the idea is, if Victor Hugo will accept them, then we'll have Mormon descendants and have great poets in Salt Lake.
And as a true French libertin, Victor Hugo happily accepts these women.
He turns them down.
He turns them down.
Okay.
Yes. So,
tell us.
So he's turning them down. What happens is this story is brought up in the conservative press. Victor Hugo is a progressive. And so they're using this story to actually make fun of him. Not that he turns down the women, but that he's too old and weak to accept them. He's become impotent. He's lost his relevance. And he, in fact, he had how could I put this? A rather unconventional marriage relationship himself. His longtime mistress had just passed away.
I remember there was actually an art exhibit in France titled Eros Hugo.
Yes, it's on now. I think it's showing. Yeah, there's an exhibit now about Victor Hugo and.
Okay, so he's become impotent. His
that's
manhood is at stake here.
That's right. Yeah, and his relevance to the political landscape is called into question by the fact that he turns down these Mormon women. And the story starts out in one conservative newspaper, Gil Blas, and by the end of the year it spread. A bunch of different papers have picked it up. Daryl translated a newspaper wrote a poem as if it were Victor Hugo writing it, saying, "Oh, I wish I was younger and could accept these young brides, but alas, I am old and I don't know anymore."
An old horse can no longer trot.
And it can no longer trot. Yeah. And Daryl translated this poem in the book, but
Right.
So it's just this whole idea that Mormonism keeps appearing over and over again, even in these like really prominent newspapers, and featuring really prominent French poets, anthropologists, sociologists, artists, etc.
Anything you guys would like to add to that? So with this idea of Hugo becoming impotent, isn't there also a sense, I mean, I've read that from the book, a sense that Mormonism is a threat, right, to masculinity, to the manhood of men in France?
Yes.
Yeah.
And
Go ahead, Heather. I've been talking too much.
I mean, yes, absolutely. And so, I mean, here in this image, you see this young man being plied with wives. So, as you might imagine, the 19th century Mormon practice of polygamy was by far the most kind of engaging aspect to our culture, and so, or of our culture to them. And so here you can see that Satan, or one of Satan's minions, is emptying out this cornucopia, all of these wives, right? And it's that you can have all of these wives if you join the church. And he is actually sort of protesting.
Yeah, this is a Frenchman here who's traveling through Salt
Right,
Lake.
right, and he's got the same gesture as you go, and in many ways, it suggests that both this image and the other, that it is in the American West and it is in this Mormon colony that we have true men who are
Who can afford more
potent
than one wife?
and who are rich. In the capitalism, we need to discuss, kind of how that works here, and that the French men don't know what to do with such an embarrassment of riches.
Yeah,
How's that?
it cuts both ways, though,
Yeah.
right? And we get it. We have a chapter on gender, and there are times too where the men are emasculated
Yes.
by it,
Subservient.
and other times where they embrace it and it sort of reasserts their dominance.
Right. In
And
fact,
I don't know if you have that image in here of Colombo.
yes, we do. If you
That-
go back to the two prints that are right there we go. Right. No,
Oh,
let's go.
that's-
Nope. Next one. Yeah, right.
There we go.
Right here. So you can see here on the left that this is one of the Mormon soldiers who is forced to go off to war, and every single one of the wives is taking a lock, right, in remembrance, and therefore depriving him of his hair. Well, we all know about Samson.
Samson, right.
And as we cut his hair, then he loses his virility. And so there is, a bit of a sense that women are asserting a modicum of control, and that the man is, a victim of sorts.
Yeah,
in
and
these-
there's this great. You might have heard the music when you walked in. That's from an operetta, 1890 operetta called Japheth's 12 Wives. There was an earlier operetta called Berthellier chez les Mormons. Berthellier meets the Mormons. It's set in Utah. The prophet is named Oscar. He's French. He's Parisian, and he's taken over. He's come over, and his superiority has quickly elevated him to the role of prophet. But his wives don't like him, big surprise, because he's kind of a jerk. And they rebel, and they write down a code that's almost like a list of demands. They protest. It's very French, right? They go out in the streets and they protest, and they have a series of demands, and they write a constitution-like code, and they demand to be liberated from their evil husband. So you do have women that are asserting their rights. You have men that are afraid, and then you have men, and that I was asking about the Hector France, Mystère du Monde.
Oh, I did not put that in. No.
Okay. But there are other instances where Frenchmen come to Utah and assert their power and sort of take control of the situation. Let me put it that way.
Sure, we could go to Robida, and there's that.
Yeah. Robida. Tell us about Robida.
Albert Robida was an illustrator. He had a very
Am I
prolific
going
career.
too far here?
That was not the best example of what we were just talking about. Let's keep going and see if we can.
That's an example, though, of
yeah.
women. That's a Robida
Oops.
of women
Too far.
sort of taking authority in the Mormon West.
Right.
You see, the man is holding nothing but a broom. No, go forward one more to
There we
this
go.
one. Yes.
Related the women with battle axes and
Yeah.
spears and stuff. And this is months after women get the right to vote and exercise
Utah.
that right
In the state of
in the
Utah.
state of Utah. So the French press was covering this and was very interested in the way that women had obtained these civic roles and rights.
I mostly like the dogs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But at the same time, these women are dressed like those who had participated in the Paris Commune and
Exactly.
in some of those French insurrections, right? So that's one of the things that we look at in this book and argue is that they're using French modes, iconographies, symbolism.
Social types.
Yeah, social types, and then just to help make us legible. But really, it's not to help make us legible. It's to sort themselves out,
Yeah.
right? And we just happen to be, and I say we, it's,
Yeah.
we are all members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. We just happen to be a kind of cipher for that.
It's critical to understand that these are important moments, or these moments of feminist intrusions into the social space at moments of revolution in 1830, 1848, 1851 to 1870 and on. And women are saying, we demand rights, we demand a place in the public sphere, we demand education, we demand an opportunity to provide for ourselves without being tied to a man's wealth or name or civil status. We demand civic rights, we demand to be able to hold office and vote and all of these kinds of things. And Mormonism comes up in both ways as a countermodel, but then also as something that's more progressive than what France had known. The French women didn't get in the vote until the middle or early of the 20th century.
After the war.
So are they looking at Utah and Mormonism in such a way that you come away with the impression that, oh, Utah with polygamy and the way it's depicted in the American media is not so bad?
That's an interesting case because one of the feminists that we cite from, a woman named Olympe Audouard, she is a lecturer. She's very well covered in the press. Alexander Dumas, the father, is a protector. And she travels to the United States, spends many, I think about 11 months, maybe 12 months in the U.S., and goes back and writes this book called Across America and the Far West, and she spends.
This is her Olympe Audouard right here with Alexandre Dumas, the novelist, Three Musketeers, and so on, right there.
Yeah, and this is Robida actually who does this full-page satirical image of Mormonism taking over Paris. After Audouard comes back from her travels and says, you know what, I've seen European polygamy. Men with mistresses who have no claim for money or for a legal status.
And the children are
who knows?
Forgotten.
Nobody's taking care of them. I prefer Mormon polygamy to European polygamy.
Yeah.
If I get the phrase right, Corey.
Yeah, and look, you have to look at the bottom here, right corner. This is Cupid, who's massive, right? So the idea of love, and holding a flag that says Mormonism. He's straddling the Seine and has overtaken Paris completely here. So there, if this were bigger, it could have been the cover of our book, I think. But it was too
expand that image anymore.
But even I'd point out too, up here, she's got this banner that says Mormonism in Paris that looks like covered hand carts, right? Covered wagons, but also in the shape of a heart. So there is this idea of this whole kind of new way of social relations, and the other vignettes get into the expense of having multiple wives, of course, and the domestic kinds of issues that might be there. But the idea is that Audouard is kind of announcing a new mode, right? A new kind of fashion that's going to come to Paris.
There's a great article we found in a newspaper called Le Journal Amusant, satirical. But it says this: you might think that polygamy's headquarters is Salt Lake, but no, it's Paris.
Paris.
Right. You talk about that Parisian Mormon. That there is a specific brand of Mormonism that is Parisian.
Yeah, and what they mean by that is this taking of mistresses and basically flaunting the conventional laws of marriage.
Critical to this is the way that they're figured as French, though. If you look at their dress, the bourgeois space with all of these objects, furniture, fabrics, these are French households, not sort of pioneer Salt Lake in 1850s or 60s. There's something else going on here.
Yeah, and I think this image is 69.
69,
so.
yeah, 1869.
So in connection with gender, if that's okay to open up a little bit.
Yeah, of course.
You talk about colonialism, but at the same time, issues of race that France was grappling with. How do they reflect that back using Mormonism?
Sure. Can I get to an image and then? This one. How's this? Right.
Perfect.
So this is from an illustrated novel called The 20th Century. And so it's kind of futuristic, imagining what it would be like to come to the marriage docks of Salt Lake City, where you would be greeted by all of these potential brides. who represented the four continents of the earth, and et cetera, et cetera. And we have a Brigham Young-like figure who is there. And you can even see, if you look at some of the advertisements on the back, that the bride's cloth, South Africa, the arrival from Borneo, Java, and Sumatra, the arrival from America, this sense that Salt Lake City, the Salt Lake Valley, is the crossroads of the world, that there's this great internationalism and globalism that is simply not true. We know that, right? That our immigrants were coming almost exclusively from Northern Europe, from Scandinavia, from the United Kingdom, and so on. But that was not part of the projection, at least of what it would be like in the next century, according to this Frenchman.
And you can see to the tie-in with capitalism, obviously here,
Yep.
right? The office, the word office is super prominent.
Yes.
And do you have the de la Croix as well?
No.
Of the women in
I
the
don't.
apartment of Algiers? But,
No,
okay.
but you will many of you will recognize the Orientalist motif of Delacroix and others, 19th century European artists who were showing women of the so-called Orient in dress and in demeanor that is very different from what you would see in 19th century Paris or 19th century Salt Lake, for that matter, right? So that they look more like they're part of a harem that we are envisioned as being really more like North Africa or the Middle East.
One thing I think it's in the French tradition, it's really common in literature and art to talk about French problems and set them in another country.
Right.
If you're in my 340 class, we've read, 2 or 3 texts already that are set in Spain. They're French texts, but set in Spain, and when you get into them, it's a safe way to talk about domestic problems by setting them somewhere else. And so, but the problem is in France at least, is that Africa, Muslims, Jews, these images already had a lot of baggage with them, and Mormons are a new figure that they can sort of manipulate and create as they go. It doesn't have the historical baggage, the violence that are already associated with some of these other groups, and so it allows all kinds of creativity and
So we
invention. Yeah.
see a lot of elements of Catholicism, of Islam, of Judaism. I mean, that get mapped on to, in both a word and image, to us. And so you get some of those the kind of an amalgam of types.
So on this point, the comparison with Islam and the idea of harems,
Yes.
that's common. How do they compare Mormons, for instance, to Jews in the 19th century? How does that express itself?
Well, so part of it is that they make similar analogies to Judaism and the figure of the Jew as a kind of wandering character and people.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, part of our project started when one of our colleagues in our organization, 19th Century French Studies, Maurice Samuels, published books early on, about the time that our project was underway, about the Israelite in France and the figure of the Jew in France. And you do have imagery that evokes Mormons as if they were Jews, these outsiders, in terms of these reports coming back of Salt Lake's financial prowess, the sort of riches that were being collected, and this negative stereotype of Jews associated with money, with usury, for example. Those were very common references for Mormons. It's a new kind of Judaism. It's a new kind of Jewish figure that's there. You see it less in the imagery and more in the texts. And with Islam, it has to do more with the polygamy as opposed to these other negative stereotypes that we see. In either case, it's ways of transposing these things. And you can understand the transposition of say, the Middle East or North Africa, the Mormons in this frontier desert of the American West, a new kind of Islam.
We will probably be moving towards the time when we allow those who are eavesdropping to join our conversation. But before that, I would like to have you react on this. It seems like if I'm reading this book as a student, right, I will find it a very interesting way to learn about important stuff, about French history, about French culture, and at the same time, even with the use of Mormonism, I don't sense the kind of anti-Mormonism that existed in the United States, but rather humor. Anything you would like to say about this, the use of humor to talk about important matters, things that are important to the French and things that are also important to Latter-day Saints?
Yeah, no, I mean, thank you for that question, because I don't know, I put percentages on it. 70% of it is probably satirical. Does that seem fair?
Yeah.
When we first started on this project, it quite bothered me that there was so much humor around polygamy, which is an extremely fraught practice. I felt like I needed to footnote that or something to say, we're not making light of a system that was difficult for many, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know how I got over that. I mean, I guess just over time, kind of recognized that there was there was a lack of awareness. First of all, right, just lots of kind of stereotypes and so on that were work there, but that also humor has a particular kind of power in sharpening kind of some of these issues. So, I mean, that's. But to your point of the anti, we found very few that were that felt that there was something dangerous.
They're not a threat. They're
No.
not an existential threat. They're not being. They're not at war with the U.S. federal government. At several different moments of the church's history in the 19th century, as this audience should know, we never were. The church never was. And in France, it had such a small presence, and it came at a time when there was oppression of non-recognized religious groups. There were only 4 that were recognized: Judaism, the Catholic Church, of course, and then 2 branches of Protestantism. Any other group that shows up was treated as a political entity as opposed to a religious entity. And because religion was wrapped up in some of reform movements earlier on in the century, it was easy to sort of suppress. When you're talking about members of the church that numbered in maybe a couple hundred over the course of these efforts at conversion during the mission, there was no existential threat in France as there was in the United States with these run-ins with the federal government.
Not even with polygamy, plural marriage? I do think that you mentioned in connection to that one government decree
There's
or
a
letter.
ministerial letter that's sent out in the early part of the Second Empire, 1852 to 1870. And in 1854, a minister sends a letter to all of the French prefects saying, if you hear of anybody preaching polygamy, then you can arrest them. It's not to take place. Or common property. And this was a veiled reference to Mormonism.
But to socialism,
and socialism,
really,
broadly speaking.
That's the bigger threat,
That's
right?
the threat. And so Mormons were wrapped up in this fear of the red specter, as it was called at that time.
Right.
One thing, in America, Mormonism is the ultimate way we define how we're American, against Mormonism, right? Americans are monogamous. They're Christian. Mormons aren't. Americans are white, and if you are familiar with Paul Reeves' book, Mormons aren't. Mormons are capitalist, democratic. Mormons are autocratic and socialist, right? So it's this way of us as East Coast Americans defining ourselves and unifying ourselves against what Mormons represent. In France, the Mormons are very French. It's very different. They're like us.
In representation,
Yes.
right? Because of this, the church being banished, from being there in France, not because of it as a religion per se, but because of the connections that it had to socialism and.
And so in France, they're saying, "Hey, look how much we're actually like this group."
Yeah.
So, And it's a way for them to ask questions about who we are as French people, as a republic or as an empire, and what are our values.
Right. They get a lot of things wrong. I would just like to, I mean, obviously. So I don't, this is a Mormon household here again.
Late 1870s.
Yeah, mid 1870s. It's part of this novel, and it's, you know, complete mayhem. And as you look at the various rooms, you've got wives fighting, and you've got or women smoking, and you know, all kinds of well, and neglecting the children who are up in the attic, in the you know, abandoned up there to care for themselves, and so on. And it really looks more like a brothel, like representations of, you know, the brothel. And so so words and images have a lot of power to shape definitions, and I think, you know, we would maintain that as you go into the 20th century, you know, we've accumulated a lot of baggage, right, that needs to be kind of dealt with in the 20th and 21st century.
So in some sense, they will, is it fair to say they took the real Mormonism and turned it into their own
Yes.
type?
It's a cultural construct that allows them to.
Yes.
Yeah. So when we use the term Marianne meets the Mormons in her title, Marianne, you know, the symbol of France and the French Republic. But the Mormons here is a figure or a type or a construct that the French create over the course of the 19th century.
And Marianne is Lady Liberty, essentially, right? She is the symbol of France. So very kind of enduring type of figure.
Great. Anything else, Daryl, maybe before we open this up to our eavesdroppers?
We didn't treat the early part of this too much, but there are utopian and socialist or communist movements. This is pre-Marxist in the 1840s that develop in France and in England, and Mormons were regularly associated with those movements. That is one moment where there is kind of a fear, a threat, and they're not quite Frenchified so much at that point. But it does make for an interesting moment when, among what are historians call romantic socialism or pre-Marxist socialism, the Mormons are wrapped up in those groups and often said to be successful, where the French homegrown movements were like the Saint Simonians or the Fourierists or the Icarians weren't, when in fact there was a lot of interaction with them. What we haven't talked about is actual encounters with members of the church, either in France.
Like Louis Bertrand, for instance.
Yes.
Yes, or in the U.S. And we don't have time for that, but that's something to pursue as well, because the church sold its properties in Nauvoo, you may not know this, to a French group called the Icarians. They're the ones that took Nauvoo over in 1847, 1848, after the pioneers left Utah Territory. That was a French group, and they knew of Mormons because one of the first French converts was an editorialist for one of the most widely read left-wing workers' association newspapers, Le Populaire, in France. That's how he met the members of the church in the first place, was by doing articles covering the church. And here you have the group installing itself in Nauvoo after. So these crisscrosses in this transatlantic exchange are extremely rich and interesting.
And Salt Lake was like a necessary stop on the grand tour of the United States in the 19th century. By train for Europeans. And so everyone that's writing a travel narrative, you know, from France, they are stopping in Utah and spending a few days with the Mormons. And so you'd be, I think, hard-pressed to look through one of these narratives and not find some kind of mention of their impressions and the like.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, we have, what, 10,
Yes.
15 minutes?
Yes.
To allow better questions from the audience.
Right. And we don't have a mic set up, so in true kind of cafe style, you can just stand up and ask your question. And if we need to, we can repeat that so that everyone can hear.
Yes.
Efforts, how effective were the Mormons? Like, did they succeed in converting anyone in France?
Yeah. The question is, how successful were the conversion efforts? They were, it seems that they had some success during a period when socialism was really popular. And when that political movement lost its steam, so did the church. And it seems to disappear practically from the landscape. You know, if anyone was converted, they would come to Salt Lake. So there was not much of there was not much momentum in France.
If I could add two comments. One is a friend and colleague of ours named Christian Evrard. This is a member of the church in France, a longstanding member who's part of the CES system there. Published his dissertation about 15 years ago, went back to school, and it's a two-part dissertation. He'll be publishing a revised version of that this fall and probably early next year, and that recounts the history of the church in France, and that details much more closely that. We're not writing a history of the church so much as this history of representations of Mormonism in France. But it is important to say that there were hundreds of converts among these working class groups that were baptized en masse. Because as they look for this sort of material and spiritual kind of salvation, they hear this message that resonates with them in the preaching of the early missionaries to France.
1850s.
Yeah.
Then you come to the point where Louis Bertrand, who was this convert you mentioned, who was the mission president, he gave up, right?
Yeah. He was just exhausted.
Saying that nothing can be hoped from.
I mean, he actually shook the dust from his feet as he left, right, and said that this is, you know, an evil country.
It was more mud than dust, if you know Paris, but still.
Great.
1862, I think.
About the time he published his memoirs, which
If you get our book, there's a handy chronology right in the beginning, Nick, and look that up.
Very helpful, actually. Yes.
You gave us the context for the book, but what was the impetus for the book? How did you all together decide this is something you wanted to do?
I think there were two things. One is seeing our friend and colleague Maury Samuels, who did this panel on the figure of the Jew as he was writing these books. He, in fact, was a dissertation advisor to one of our colleagues, Sarah Phoenix, and so, you know, kind of a healthy kind of communication between him and several of our department members. And we thought, why can't we do this? And I think it was Corey who first proposed it, but we all three separately have worked on projects related to this. So Corey published an essay early on in his career on a very important writer and ministerial figure, Mary May. And this essay was called Les Mormons, one of the first writings actually on Mormons. Heather's been working for a long time on a book on female artists who go to Paris and who train there and come back.
LDS, from
LDS.
Utah, right? They go and study in Paris.
And then I had written in dissertation and other work on this author-illustrator Roby Daw, and had found this chapter. What we didn't tell you is the story of this futuristic novel. It's written in 1883, but it takes place in 1953, when Mormons have taken over England. English have left England for India because of its natural resources, and Mormons are then threatening the continent from England, where they've taken over. And so we
And
had
the women are in charge, by the way, in case
They're the
you were
police, yeah, the
wondering. They're
police.
the police. They are the major politicians.
They
they're the
arrest any men that are single.
men
Yes.
are imprisoned,
single
right?
men go to the prison of celibates,
Right.
where they are punished for that.
This
So-
is critical because those celibates, if they don't accept forced marriage by the end of their time in jail, are deported to New Caledonia and
Is
the
where
Pacific.
Dreyfus and other political
Unionards who have been
prisoners.
deported. So this
Yeah.
is overlapping French
France.
history
Yeah.
and tensions. So we all had worked to some extent on topics and started realizing, and we didn't say this before, but we thank Google for this book, because Google said, we're going to digitize the world's library, and the French said, oh no, you're not. That's our cultural patrimony. And it was right about the time that we started this that they began digitizing, sending tens of millions of euros to the National Library to produce these searchable documents that now are a boon for us and grow, by the way, by the month. We continue to find new images and new texts with this.
Daryl recently discovered that one of the most common references to Mormon in what was it, the 1880s, Daryl?
Yeah.
Is to a racehorse that they named Mormon. And
The Mormon.
The Mormon.
And he won.
He won, yeah.
He was a
you hear
winner.
it all the time. So I don't know what to make of that exactly, but yeah.
Yes, Sarah?
It's so fascinating for so many reasons, but it brings together, it foregrounds two things that I don't associate with the LDS Church in the 21st century. And one is socialism, of course, but the other is humor.
Right. Yes.
Desperately lacking a humor tradition.
Yes.
But did you find that Mormons in the 19th century ever came into contact with these representations of themselves in France, or was there any attempt, deliberate attempt to distance themselves from this?
I can point to two. First of all, Louis Bertrand, in his memoirs,
Right.
talks extensively about this, and I don't think he really appreciates much of that. He was a cultured, traveled English speaker, and I think he was more frustrated with French culture.
He was not very funny, Bertrand. No.
He's a little too sober.
Yeah.
The poor man he died in Tooele. He eventually left France and was trying to conduct these experiments on French varieties of grapes, and thought that Utah would be this perfect arid landscape for grapes.
For vineyards to make wine,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
The other thing is, we don't have many records of these French-speaking members from early on, and so it's hard to say what they thought. Bertrand really is the voice of this group.
Right.
And for example, these operettas, the plays that we found, I didn't see any evidence that they were ever performed. There was a huge theater in Salt Lake before the temple, but there were French plays performed there, but none of these. I don't think these reached Salt Lake.
To your point, Mormons, Latter-day Saints, take themselves too seriously, but that's generally the characteristics of believers. They rarely like to be portrayed and depicted and satirized. So,
I will
not
say,
surprised at Bertrand's
I have to say though, Sarah, I had a colleague visit. I was teaching a Book of Mormon class. This is Stefan Pied. Do you know Stefan? He's French. He came and visited, and he came to that class with me. And after the Book of Mormon class, he was just shocked. He said, "I can't believe you and your students were laughing that much." And he thought that we actually had a fairly healthy relationship with our faith, in a way that he said, there are religious groups in my university, he teaches at a state school, that you can't make any jokes about them, or you get, and you're joking about yourselves all the time. So maybe that's just me, Sarah. And you, but in defense of a little bit of humor in our
Targets
tradition.
in one sense, but the French actually are very creative. They're very creative with the visual art and with these plays, the vaudevilles that Corey and our colleague
there is
Chris
in that
translated.
a
Very
whole tradition in France of blaspheme and depicting with Catholicism, anti-clericalism. It was easy for them to replace Catholicism with Mormonism in that sense.
Yeah, and if you
Right.
look through the
Laughing.
book, you'll see a number of images of LDS or Brigham Young, for example,
I didn't bring in that particular one.
dressed like a pope, right, with the same kind of garb, ritual garb. But
Yeah.
go ahead.
Right. Well, you just see a lot of that. So these are both Catholic martyrs as well, and we get some of that. These are 19th century French salon paintings, and then this is a representation of Joseph Smith healing or raising from the dead, actually, a young girl, and you can just see there are a lot of kind of Catholic overtones to that. Or we didn't bring in that at all. And the one thing we didn't get to touch on, but that is probably my favorite part of the book, is because I work on gender and it was just all of the exploration of definitions of masculinity and femininity, and this particular figure who was for a few of my students who were here, kind of the new Mormon woman, and she basically could outride and outshoot and out talk any Mormon man. And here she's got these are the mobs that are coming to threaten Joseph Smith, and she's not having it. And so she's protecting him and others and telling them to go back and tell them that you were beaten by a woman, right? That you were bested by a woman. So there are some fantastic characters in there that, of course, I immediately am thinking, who are they thinking about? Are they thinking about Emma Smith, or are they thinking about Eliza R. Snow, or what would be here? Because this is an actual translation of an American novel, but it takes a very French kind of turn, especially in its representation. That this is like the woman that so many people are worried about in 19th century France, who is kind of undoing our expectations of behavior and feminine behavior and the like.
You should point out that these images are not in the American edition. This is the French edition. This is the value that they bring to this text that's translated.
Heather, back up one. Look at her hand and look at his hand, right? There's this sort of idea that she has as much authority almost as Joseph Smith. Just if you look at the way they're
right.
And there's a kind of mesmeric quality too. That's a chapter we didn't get into, but we have a chapter on occultism and mesmerism and mediumism.
Yeah.
Sort of the supernatural and the way the French viewed our faith.
Other questions? Yes.
I like this stuff. It seems like a lot of this work is prints. Is there any Mormon influence into other art forms like fashion or paintings? I mean, they have some of the huge, biggest French artists at the time, like Manet, Degas. Is any Mormonism in there, or is it just printmaking?
No, it's we have one painting that was actually done by I'm trying to remember where it is, an American who was in Paris it may have actually been shown first in the United States. So this one I feel kind of it's pretty rare, right? Kind of representation. So not in fashion, not in paintings, if you're thinking of other visual media, but as we said, theater, musicals.
We have examples of, we know what Mormon, if you go to the Japheth's 12 Wives, so you can see how French imagined women dressed in Utah. This is Act 1, and the wives are all wearing this. By Act 3, when they go to Paris, they're dressed in pink, which was fashionable in Paris at the time. So they actually kind of convert to French. They go backwards, right? And we have good descriptions and even photos of their dress.
And on that note, I'd have to say that most Mormon women who were living in Salt Lake would be appreciative of the fact that they weren't being portrayed as these backwater provincial
good clothes.
Yes, hicks who have no sense of fashion, because Mark Twain, went out and said that the women are all dowdy and poorly dressed and ugly. And so in many ways, to get to Sarah's question, we don't have the response, but my guess is a lot of the women here would have been appreciative of being likened unto a Parisienne instead of, the kind of caricature that most Americans had made.
Okay. Any more comments? Maybe last words? It's about 5. And is it maybe the last word we get from you, Heather, or Daryl, or Corey? And taste.
Read the book.
I have read it. I strongly encourage everyone. You will enjoy reading it. Yeah.
And you should laugh at almost every
Yeah.
chapter, Scott.
Yeah.
Barrels of laughs.
So, I think I will have the last word in thanking you all for coming and saying, let them eat eclairs.